Great. Check it. Can you guys hear me? Okay. All right. Hallelujah. Just remind us that we have the 2022-23 Dean Distinguished Speaker Series, aiming to facilitate conversations among the scholars that we heard here in the room. Our speaker series, as people here in the room maybe not heard, builds on our university's efforts related to community public engagement, increasing expectations of how to address these issues. In fact, in the meeting today, that was part of our discussion. What is this DEI? How to think about it in discussions. This is our final speaker in this series, and Professor Margaret Beale Spencer is a fine capstone to a productive series that began with Cedric Warren, Vanderbilt University, Joy Gaston Gales, North Carolina State University, Tiffany Lee, University of New Mexico, April Baker Bell, Michigan State University. All the thanks to obviously IT for what they do, the DEMI committee, also the Vice Chancellor, the Assistant Professor of Development Program, Deans Anderson and Musa, and of course, others, Daniel Ward, Native American House, Amy and the RAs, Angelique, Molly, Hannah. I think that's everyone. Thank you for a productive series over the last academic year. As a language institution in the University of Illinois at Bench, Champaign has responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we will begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Castilla, Bianca, William, Miami, Masuchin, Udawa, Sac, Mexicoaki, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these native nations for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community of all of our differences with Native people at the core of our efforts. Finally, a reception is following in O'Leary, just next door. The lectures being live streamed, and we'll do our best to moderate Q&A at the top of the hour. Professor Margaret Beale Spencer is the Charles F. Gray Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the college, and is the Marshall Field Fourth Professor of Urban Education at the University of Chicago. A developmental psychologist, she is also an alumna of the Committee of Human Development at the University of Chicago. Before returning to Chicago, she was the endowed overseas professor and director of the Interdisciplinary Studies of Human Development program and faculty member in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania, Psychology and Education Division. Additionally, she was the director of the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Health Achievement, Neighborhood Growth, and Ethnic Studies changes, and also guided advocates in overall effort, the W.E.B. Du Bois Collective Research Institute. Guiding noted efforts in continuing to frame her scholarship. Professor Spencer's phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, PBEST, provides an identity-focused cultural ecological perspective, which frames a gender, race, culture, and context, acknowledging program of human development research. Recognizing the universality of human variability, the theory addresses resiliency, identity, and competence formation processes for diverse humans situated both in the United States and abroad. Having authored over 140 scholarly publications, edited several volumes, and provided congressional testimony in the nation's capital, Margaret Beale Spencer was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, 2019. She is the recipient of the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association, and the 7th Developmental Science 2018 Revolving Journal Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Science, and the Society for Research in Child Development Award for Distinguished Contributions to Cultural and Ecological Research. Professor Margaret Beale Spencer's scholarship has been generating dozens of grants supported by foundations and federal funding submissions, as well as an ABC, CNN program broadcasted internationally. Without further ado, thank Professor Margaret Beale Spencer.
Used to being here, it's microphones here. Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Hobson, for the valued introduction. Just appreciate it. I'll begin by sharing my sincere appreciation for the opportunity to provide a distinguished lecture for the College of Education, University of Illinois, at a grad Champaign. I am deeply honored to do it. Thank you. On multiple levels, the current period is a pregnant moment. It's a pregnant moment of opportunity for our nation and the globe, as well as a period of a continuing challenge as well. I plan to provide a particular perspective concerning a few uncomfortable 21st century realities, including why there is a continuing resistance to diversity goals, inclusion requirements, and equity necessities. In fact, I have looked forward to sharing and being in conversation with you as a community of admired scholars who are collectively sharing why a radical interrogation of flawed perspectives is absolutely needed for the collective thriving of diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly as we move into the 21st century. In fact, when queried about your expectations for today's visit, my assistant reported feedback that a goal for today's lecture and my visit was to respond to the query as to whether diversity, inclusion, and equity will die. Instead, I wish to share a particular perspective that will aid in emboldening us about DEI. That is, as opposed to remaining on the defensive, I believe our science as practice traditions provide the scaffolding for offensive strategies. As a reminder of the perceptions that I have of you, I've invited Amy Summers to hand out a little memento or a symbolic reminder about today's conversation about DEI and who we are as engaged scholars and what we can do both singularly and collectively to instigate further positive change important to DEI goals. In other words, I have no interest in talking about death. Alternatively, my interest is that DEI is thriving. You will note that this little keepsake is good enough for a wallet or to be tucked into a makeup case. My basic goal is that you may keep it tucked away but available for massaging as a reminder when you are sitting at a decision-making table at particular times when your voice and perspective are especially needed. I believe the exercise will provide the reminder needed for bringing attention to themes especially important to DEI. In other words, don't wimp out on me. All right? The perspective scaffolding our remarks today is that a particular viewpoint has been ignored in DEI conversations. The shortcoming continues to have implications for the science produced, its use in training professionals for providing intended social supports, and it has been redundantly reproduced as policies that have not provided the efficacy promised. Instead, their use have further supported stereotyping and fueled power negotiations that further disenfranchise those for whom culturally sensitive, developmentally, and socially relevant supports are needed for offsetting long-term harm. The position taken is that our social science machinery has consistently failed to acknowledge the humanity of communities of color. The short-sightedness produces unacknowledged character virtue shortcomings. For social scientists and education researchers operating within a knowledge-generating and disseminating professional context, failing to acknowledge that humanity perspectives are not used for those marginalized as the others matters as a function of race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and other categories of difference and intersectionality. The underlying assumption of dehumanization makes a huge impact. That is, functioning as the research tradition and as cultural practices, the research designed, generated, interpreted, and utilized as practice and policy then reinforce stereotypes, given their ineffectiveness to show all efficacy for offsetting harm as a function of historical dehumanizing practices. Thus, this presentation forwards the position that character virtue is not only a theme imposed as moral development research, analyzed about other people, their children. As well, it requires application within social science research and practice traditions, and has been described by Gutierrez and others as stable repertoires of practice. So problematically, practice traditions within our social science traditions persistently represent people of color and thinks about difference in problematic and deficit assuming ways. The failing reinforces resistance then to diversity, inclusion, and equity goals. The dilemma is that differences are conceptualized as deficits, thus persistently suggesting stereotypes of less than equal status. So the conceptual shortcoming that represents, let's go there, 20 to 22 intergenerationally communicated social practices and science traditions given Blacks' arrival to Virginia 400 years ago. The representation of diversity by the social sciences as leadership practices, and we are all leaders, fails to acknowledge the reality of this deficit assuming social science culture. The critique to be presented today for your consideration and ideally for some discussion underscores the failure to acknowledge shortcomings evident as stable scholarly practices. As noted, the reference practices have to do with ignoring the fact of shared humanity, and moving forward, I'll provide an analysis of the shortcoming frame from phenomenological variant ecological systems theory framing, generally referred to as PBES. As well, I will call into conversation the role of character virtue. Now, implicating character virtue concerns acknowledges that science is in a state of continual revision and updating, but must as well function with a conscience. In this approach, treating knowledge as capital, this presentation acknowledges individual and collective research practices that may inadvertently contribute to the concerns about DEI. The dilemma of our own contributions to problematic practices was driven home recently by an editorial in the journal Science. The editor-in-chief, Holden Thorpe, noted the following, and I quote, "The process of science is one of continual revision, but it's also one that must have a conscience." He wrote that editorial in response to the fact of the year of the transistor, and acknowledging that Shockley was one of the co-inventors of the transistor. And let's be clear, the transistor it represents almost Silicon Valley. That's how important it was. But Holderthorpe's editorial also acknowledged that in terms of conscience, is that yes, Shockley was a co-inventor of the transistor, which underscores everything that's happening in Silicon Valley, but he was a eugenicist. And we can't ignore that fact. So conscience matters. So under-acknowledged cultural ways of learning and doing science are impactful. They suggest cultural practices that can act as harmful science traditions and scaffolding for policy relevant practices. So more to the point, these traditions have consequences for the resistance that we all experience and know about in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equity goals. Thus, they have implications for whether diversity, inclusion, and equity goals die or in fact are embraced. What I'm suggesting is that each of us has a role to play in the success of diversity, inclusion, and equity values. My viewpoint is that our contributions are linked to how we approach our science. That is inadvertently continuing the practice of contributing to science and to science traditions that others' differences promotes a context of marginalization, dehumanization, stereotyping, and problematizing. So this under-interrogated exercise of scaffold dehumanizing beliefs about those considered other. And my viewpoint is that new ways of thinking about shared humanity is needed. As an exemplar of the noted shortcoming, please recall that in another 8 months, we will celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, 1954. And it is unnecessary to remind ourselves that in many places across our nation, conditions are as dire for children of color today as was the case when the Brown decision was offered as the remedy for offsetting the harm imposed by those conditions. So what I'd like to do very quickly in terms of just sharing this perspective is go through a group of slides. And I was thinking about this, it was important that I simply go to the individuals who've been talking about these things for a long time, and I studied the voice. And so what his messages have always said was that we really don't know a lot of knowledge. You know a lot of stereotypes, but not knowledge about people of color. And that we're not thinking appropriately about race. And I would add the Du Bois's to this quote is that in too many instances, we still refuse to think more appropriately about the humanity of people of color. So, of course, given the history of Brown, we know that in fact, the Clark's work was used as the footnote 11. But what's important about in terms of how we misuse social science, what they used in the Clark's work, was not developmentally sensitive in terms of the implications of it for different developmental periods, number one. And number two, because I interviewed Clark when he was at Morehouse doing a stint, most importantly for him, because, he was an angry man. I'm rather pissed myself, actually. They did not include his research that spoke to the impact of those conditions of segregation, et cetera, on white youngsters as well. So here we are 70 years later, when the information was there, but it was not used because why? The Supremes had their own assumptions about the problem, and the problem was Black and brown bodies. So what I can say to you is, it's working. So what I can say to you is that yes, they did the research, but in terms of our role as leaders, is not just the conduct of the research. It's making sure that the interpretations of the research are not weaponized against those for whom they're supposed to support. Are you following me? So we have a responsibility, not just in terms of conscience, but also in terms of interrogating, and interrogating the findings. So what these slides do is to basically describe that for the subsequent years after the Brown studies, and also clinical observations, that the data were pretty much the same, but what we were able to demonstrate subsequent to the Clark's work is that we were not taking into account people's humanity, that is children's cognitive development, children's socio-emotional functioning, developmentally that can be separate from their ways of knowing. So all these nuanced understandings about human development of kids of color, we've evolved, if you will, research contributed to as well to in the interim, but still there are so many stereotypes that people use as data as opposed to authentic understanding that we know about difference. So these studies basically have shown that children who are developing in context, it is the context that may deliver, if you will, messages that given their developmental period may or may not be internalized. Kids are smart. They tell you what they're exposed to. Kids are very smart. They tell you what they're exposed to. But when kids are very young, those messages may not be internalized. They simply tell you what they hear. What they hear like the adults say. What they observe when they navigate space. But they may not internalize those ideas. So we've been able to basically do a lot of good research during the interim of 20 years since the Brown decision. But there's still, people make careers off of pathologizing. I mean, certainly this notion of John Ogbo's, the 4M, in terms of acting white, was just one of those, if you will, research science studies that was misused. To further, if you will, the othering of certain individuals, right? But the bottom line is that we think about young people, white kids, black kids, doesn't make a difference. Kids have a need to show that they're all of that in a bag of chips, that they're super, right? And so when someone is different, you want to feel better, you put them down in some way, but it's not science, it's adolescent and middle childhood behavior. Are you following me? But part of the problem here is that there is a decision, there is a choice to misuse information. So this goes on in terms of differences, there are always, ways of being creative and cute, talking about bananas or talking in terms of Asian American kids or Oreos or whatever, but they're simply child behavior. They're child or adolescent behavior, but should not be taken to say something about the ego processes, okay, of people at particular developmental periods. So my point here is that social science is powerful, but we need to have some responsibility and show a set of conscience in terms of how we use it. So we generally, when Margaret started publishing in the 70s, began talking about the context. Well, we as social scientists are part of the context, right? So it was helpful that he developed an ecological systems theory, but we knew better even before Margaret began publishing. Before there was Rob Greger, there were ecological scientists who were part of the Kansas tradition. This is Herbert Wright, etc. These are folks who create to look at it and say, just a very experienced and when it has context, makes a difference for who you are. What we've been able to do, basically, adding to the work from EST and from the early ecological psychologists, again, emphasizing this perspective of human development processes experienced by everyone, including people of color, to basically lean on some of the orthogonal perspectives about what these processes, biological changes, the socio-emotional changes, the cognitive changes, what does that mean for how kids make sense of the world? So we added in this work the importance of emphasizing the phenomenological process, and that is given these human development processes together, what do they mean for young people in terms of our research, right? And how do we interpret it? So PBET came out of this need to integrate the domains of human development and to basically generate a theory that takes into account how people make sense of things. So we already have data from special psychology in particular that just talks about independent of what one's, if you will, shortcoming is. We know that blind people We know that people have different kinds of, if you will, developmental issues. They don't make meaning of life, right? So even if you can't, you can't hear, you can't see, you have a way of understanding the world. You make sense of it, and that determines what you do next. So what we were able to do is to, approach human development for diverse people of color by acknowledging their systems that work at the same time. Let me give you an example. I know that some of you may focus on, say, cognitive development in terms of the language or whatever, or if it's clinically focused on ego processes, or if you're more biologically or neuroscience oriented, you may look at the biological. But the bottom line is all these systems work together. And for youngsters of color in particular, that system, that intersectionality of their domains of functioning deserve consideration. They deserve good research in order to understand how they impact what comes next. Like the example I was sharing this morning with colleagues with whom I had breakfast is that I happen to have a 15-year-old grandson who grew 5 inches in each of 2 9-month periods. So at 15 years old, a new 15-year-old, he now stands at 6'4", and obviously he's not finished yet. And so the issue is then for him, these biological processes really matter. So in my retirement, I want to know how he's handling all this. How he's handling the fact that he needs shoes every few weeks. Baseline stuff like that. Other kids want to get Nikes, they look good. You need to get Nikes because his toes are tight. So the bottom line is that these human development processes are in place for kids of color as well. But in terms of how we do our research and how we interpret those findings, very often they don't consider this sort of a systems way of thinking about other people's children. So what we know with that in terms of how these 3 domains of functioning work together, we know that we as social scientists have to think about culturally appropriate, developmentally sensitive ways of designing supports. Because if we don't use research in our thinking in this way, that means that we're misusing resources. We're trying to design supports that may not make a difference. The supports have to make sense. And that's especially for individuals who represent, a history of lots of risk, lots of challenges, and not a lot of supports that make sense, like the Brown decision. Okay, we get that. Okay, so this is where we've been. This is where we've been in our science. We basically, number one, assumed that vulnerability means risk, and that we've done our social science in very linear ways. We've looked at vulnerability as risk, and then we've looked at outcomes. You know what this guarantees? That guarantees you another publication. That's all that it does. This linear, if you will, relationship here. I mean, even my 4 or 5-year-old grandchild knows this. If you have certain, difficulties here, you're going to have this. And our linearity dependent statistical packages allow for us to get a 0.001 for that relationship. So it's not going to be very helpful, that's my point. So what we've done in terms of PBES is that we're sort of providing, if you will, I know, your eyes are glazing over, it's okay, I understand. But for those of you used to this, please help your name. The bottom line is that we are critiquing. This is how we've done business. And too often we've emphasized the risk as opposed to the protective factors. So the important thing about a PBES perspective or something like it is that we acknowledge the human vulnerability of everybody. So when you think about, for example, the Proud Brothers and all these other right-wing groups, their vulnerability level is different because the risk for them would have to do with uninterrogated self in terms of privilege as capital, the whiteness as privilege and capital, right? And so therefore diversity for them may mean having to share opportunities, that they took for granted. Are you following me? So what vulnerability means for certain communities may be different for other communities. But but given Rebecca's here, given how we think about policies, we need policies that respond to the diversity of our young people. Because young people have different experiences. Some are, if you will, eventful, okay, and dissonant, and others have been pretty consonant, right? So the consonant even, prevents one from having less practice dealing with challenge. If you're living in a state of consonance, you don't have to practice adaptive coping methods. So trying to overturn the government on January 6th, and that's something very different for you. Are you following it? So we need empathy for everybody. We need to see everybody's point of view, and therefore be able to design strategies that make sense for everybody's children, given the history that remains uninterrogated. And DeSantis has his way. Okay, we'll continue. We won't go there. Okay, so for me, this has been the simple publication guarantee what question. Vulnerability level, I look at some outcome. This is what social science has been for the last 50 years. I'm not using my conscience and telling the truth. You need to give me a little feedback here. I don't think I'm off on that. People have made very productive careers with 300-400 publications, okay, with this linear association. Like I said, my 5-year-old granddaughter would get. This is the what. If we're going to design appropriate supports, it is the how that's important. It is the how that we have to investigate. So what we then does is simply say, part of our humanity, we need to understand given vulnerability level differences, how much risk I have this situation versus protective factors, I'm going to experience some stress, right? Okay. Dr. Jared, we had this conversation, my clinician here, he knows we're going to experience some stress, right? Because we have developmental tasks that we have to meet. Okay, university wants to meet it diversely, faculty inclusion tasks, right? Because of some dissonance, we want that dissonance to be less, if we want to understand what are the, if you will, challenges to it. Because otherwise the stress becomes too great and very often trickles down to us. All right, so therefore, listen to how question, and then the idea is to have support to diminish some of the stress. And when there is stress, with my clinicians, I want to have some adaptive, if you will, supports here to keep kids from engaging in maladaptive versus adaptive solution as reactive coping. Why? Because everybody has the same developmental task. Just because you're a kid of color, it doesn't mean our expectations for you are different. We expect success. If you don't get it, we're going to check you off as failed. Hello? That makes no sense. So that's what happens. Developmental tasks are the same. The support are not the same. And sure, tech, the 400 years of history, 22 generational opportunities have not worked. Okay? So we need supports that make sense to make sure that in these developmental tasks, there are adaptive coping methods. I'm going to go through a couple in a second, just to give you some exemplars. And what's important about these reactive coping methods is that it means them that to become internalized as identities. Identities ideally positive. So what did Erickson tell us, my clinical colleagues? Erickson told us, and this I buy, even that psychoanalytically oriented theory, is that even having an identity, these ego processes are so baseline and they're so important that even having a maladaptive and negative identity is better than having none. May I repeat that again? For one, psychological integrity, having an identity, even if it's negative, is better than having none at all. And therefore, that is why this system looks this way. It is not a linearity set of experiences. Our lives are not like that. That's not who we are. Our very biology is a system, right? So we need to acknowledge that. and know that once you have one or the other linked to some developmental period, and you have particularly, framed, if you will, outcomes, whatever you're measuring at the time, as you are rolling across the life course, that's going to increase your level of vulnerability, the balance or imbalance between risk and protective factors. That means that other productive outcomes linked to that negative identity, linked to those maladaptive way of coping with the stress of developmental tasks. You define the future, and you've made somebody's career. I'm going to tell you that. And then I say, when you old, that's my base. Okay, so these issues are especially relevant when you come to particular communities of individual and Black boys in particular. And I had a interest in Black boys development for a long time. Probably in the interest of transparency, I would say, growing up as the youngest of 3 girls, never having brothers, I was always interested. I felt the guys were kind of interested. As much more of a bio and more physical science person, I also knew a little bit something about that Y chromosome. And it's fragility, right? It is not a sexist statement, guys. I'm simply saying, okay, all right,
Go ahead.
okay. But my point of emphasizing that is that there is fragility. Okay, and why does that matter? It matters because we drank the Kool-Aid around male superiority long term. So here's the situation. We've got these fellas with all our high expectations for them without recognizing what? That they have particular risks that are associated with just dating boys. So think about this. At the biological level, there are these sources of fragility, but at the social and expectational level, and their expectations we have of them, that they have more difficulty in essence responding to. We keep them on a pedestal without scaffolding support. So that's why I am especially interested in the experiences of boys, irrespective of race, ethnicity. I just think that because the seniority status placed on malehood goes back so many centuries, people are dealing with reality as well. What does it mean in the current situation? Okay, so another way that I've thought about this, but quickly I'll do this, again, that feeds into why folks did over 300 or 400 publications, is that let's look at the vulnerability issue. That we can see that, yes, there are people who are high risk with low supports, and yes, there are people with low risk and high supports, and guess what? Another 300 publications. We compare these two, we do it all the time. And guess what? We find lots of P less than 0.001 findings. I mean, really? What surprises there? There is low-hanging fruit that I think is important for us that allows us to contribute to this diversity, inclusive conversation in very substantive ways. There are youngsters who may be low risk, but psychologically they don't experience anything but a sense of low protection, right? Then you have kids here who, yes, in terms of my clinical colleagues, they know this, they've experienced trauma, they live under conditions of high risk, but they also have been able to identify, utilize, right, sources of support. This is low-hanging fruit. We can understand sort of even minimal supports that are needed here, even under conditions of high risk, to keep them resilient and thriving. These youngsters are important here as low-hanging fruit because number one, they're important because they don't make a lot of noise until they cross over the line. In the sense of, this kid loses his girlfriend, his parents get a divorce, or whatever. So suddenly they may live in a low-risk situation, but their low-risk protective factor presence status becomes even much more, if you will, absent what is needed for psychological stability. Right, following me. It's not, you can do the research, it is not surprising that, I mean, heck, your former president, no name names, you could put him in this category. Certainly individuals who, in terms of, you look at his biography, in terms of even looking at folks who were the Columbine shooters and other individuals after that, and very often they fit this category. So there's a knowledge building perspective. There is diversity, right? But we can only think about it in limited terms. It undermines our ability to make a difference. So what I can say in terms of even this representation of PBES as a more manageable way of understanding what we can do in terms of how we think and interpret findings is that there's this other way of thinking about quadrants of kids and how we can support them, and the fact that they've got to be supported differently because they are different. Are you following me? Okay, so the bottom line is that even as we consider, oops, sorry, I'm a little excited here. Even when we consider PBES, we've got to consider the context. And I would say 400 years from 1619 to now, there have been a lot of things that have happened that have not been included in our programs of research. And we forget the context, we limit ourselves. We limit ourselves in terms of being able to understand the source of diversity, and therefore the importance of inclusion and importance of having a programming that makes sense for all kids. So very quickly, what I would say here is that we've done a lot of programming ourselves that demonstrate wedges, what you do in terms of interventions to make a difference. One of the things that we've done, some of the things we've done here, one of them is it takes a lot of money and work, so you've got to do collaborations. One is a collaboration between a national organization of disability and university context and also the school system. What we're able to do is take special ed kids, special ed youngsters who have an IEP, they have an extra difficult time. Because they very often are problematized and done in by their peers and also by the school system. So we had a collaboration with these three organizations. We were able to bring high school special education students who were functioning on a 4th, 5th grade level. And by the time they finished in 3 years, we had number one, a triple the graduation rate, and we had kids going over training, et cetera. But you have to basically do things that make sense to them. We took them out of a toxic environment or the high school. We put them on Penn's campus. We trained, we contextualized our teachers, and we gave them opportunities to work and get feedback about their own identity as having efficacy. It made a huge difference. One of the things we're doing now is working through the Center for Providing Assistance first. We also were able to collaborate with a foundation that had money available and for for 43 high schools in the Northeast. We were able to sample for kids who were within one standard deviation of the poverty line. And these are high school students, and we have kids who were AP students and impoverished, and kids who were PD students. But it needed money. Adolescents are expensive. You know that. So if kids need money to sort of focus on the task at hand, well, then you give them money, but they have to have an outcome. What we did was to the AD students, we said, keep your AD grades and we'll give you a stipend every month. For the CD students, you need to come to school and you need to at least maintain that, if not improve. And what we were able to do is to give the CD students also a new identity. The AD students, we call them scholars full of their academics, scholars through academic experience. And the CD students, we call them digital scholars, and we call them challenges. And so we gave them a new identity and help information providers. We taught CD students not to necessarily identify with their schools or in which they had bad experiences, but we taught them to be helpless students in their communities, in their families. And that new identity was enough to give them the impetus that they needed to re-engage with school. So we had CD students that suddenly became AD students, right? But you have to take the perspective of the other. What are the needs in terms of risk or challenges that are, if you will, significant enough that you can impact to get the outcome of the goal and raise them? Okay, and then we're also doing work with the police department. Now we are youth and male youth and law enforcement officers, you know, that's a pretty difficult situation. So we're using an artificial intelligence, the computational approach, in the collaboration with the police department, and we're trying to determine whether or not police officers responsive to young people might be defined by what they hear. It's a very different approach. I'm kind of excited about that. In addition to that, let's see, how am I doing this? We're working with, in the interest of transparency, I'm working with my son who is at the EdTech program, EdTech company, and we're using hip hop. We're using turntable technology and a curriculum, a standards linked curriculum, to use as a sort of draw for students to learn STEM. Turntabling and hip hop is nothing but music and science. I think probably music and math. I'm starting to rush, so sorry about it. I'm gonna slow down. Be 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you. So I'm gonna see if I can play this slowly. Whoops. Yeah. I don't have sound. Okay. Well,
If you click more,
like
at
more.
the top, the three dots.
What's this
top
now?
right,
Oh,
more,
click with this.
no.
What do I do?
Computer.
I'd like you to hear this because this principal, I think he must have been an early DJ himself.
So click more, and then it'll say enable sound, share computer sound, all the way third up from the bottom. Boom.
I'd like you to hear this because this principal, I think he must have been an early DJ himself.
Click
Can you
more,
go back,
and
please?
then it'll say
Yeah, oh, it's maybe this is it. Maybe
sound,
this is it.
share computer sound, all the way third up from
Okay,
the bottom.
maybe I can't do this. I'd like you to hear this because this principal,
Thank you
I think he
so
must
much
have been an
for
early DJ himself. Honestly,
Can you go back?
I take this side.
Share computer sound all the way third up.
Okay, maybe I can't do this. I'd like you to hear this because this principal, I think he must have been an early DJ himself. Honestly,
Share computer sound all the way third up.
Okay, maybe I can't do this. I'd like you to hear this because this principal, I think he must have been an early DJ himself. So we have to use, honestly,
So what advice do you get for a scientific social scientist outside of this field that is interested in doing the very kind of work that we're talking about here, which is elevating the humanity of marginalized, in my case, young people, so that we can have solutions, as you say, that are more than just what you showed in the doll study in the Kenneth Club. So
Thank you for that. That's a really good question. And I don't want anyone who is not in, psychology or whatever to think that they have to, absorb something like this, but instead just to know and appreciate the humanity and the baseline aspect of humanity that I want to make sure that we all appreciate is that part of our, part of who we are. This is from day one in terms of infants. That there is a need to show that I can have an impact on the world. And when that is thwarted, it causes dissonance. It causes dissonance. So, given that basic need, it is the responsibility of all of us humans as part of the context to basically, provide support that allow that essence of wanting to make a difference to survive, while also being aware of the outside world and our need to adjust what we do and how we do it to the outside world. And I think for me is that basic recognition, that's our humanity. We come into this world, just a buzz of things, right? And therefore it's the role of socialization just to kind of tailor that a little bit to make you fit in the world. But the problem with history is that the subjugation of certain people was designed not for them to have a sense of efficacy, but for them to serve, at the behest of other people. Either basic humanity to be ignored. And so I think what you've described here is that, just a documentation of how this was done in support. And those as memories, what those, positive experiences did in allowing one to feel, efficacious and whole and loved, etc. So when we do science, social science in a way that denies that basic humanity, because our humanity is based upon, if you will, a power position. And our identity is such that we can't imagine a self without hegemony. That's a problem. That's a problem. I'm worried about everybody, but for different reasons. And so our job is to understand that. And you have to have the history. The way I calculated in terms of, the way I calculated in terms of, unacknowledged 400 years of under-interrogated, if you will, history, and how it has differentially impacted different communities, is that you think, just think about it in terms of maybe just conservatively, just having just 2 meals a week together where socialization takes place over food. We talk, right? We watch each other. In those years, there might have been 44,000 missed opportunities to acknowledge the shared humanity. It's my rough estimate, I like numbers, but who knows, my estimate. I estimate 44,000 opportunities for just one family. So we think about that intergenerationally connected, et cetera, it didn't happen. And so here we are now. So, I don't think we should be concerned about diversity, inclusion, and equity, dying. I think it's our job to use history to illustrate why, in fact, for everyone's survival and thriving, we need to go there. And that's why the mirror. We need to go there. But we're talking about active efforts not to engage and continue this, pattern of, thousands and thousands and thousands of missed opportunities. And then we look at children's responses to these uneven contexts, and we make careers off reporting on that without pointing the finger at ourselves. We know better. We know what good science needs to look like for understanding everybody's humanity, culturally experienced in myriad contexts. We know better. And in fact, as social scientists, we've not gone there. We have weaponized our ignorance. We have weaponized our ignorance, and it is volitional. There's nothing accidental about this. So, we're in this place when I am sharing in terms of this little memento. Remember this talk, and I want you to be as annoyed as I am. It's nicer than saying pissed. I want you to be as annoyed as I am about this situation, because children are taking on the responsibilities of our neglect. I'm focusing on, just the need to take other people's perspective. I'm focusing on the need to, change, if you will, the power negotiation. And people are asking us to do this work with the DEI. It's their power that's asking us to do their job. And so the answer should be heck no. But that's all I'm saying is that I don't want us to focus on the children anymore, adolescents, let them grow and be and thrive. We are the problem. When I began this work, 50 years ago, there wasn't a literature. We know better now. We've got the statistical packages, we can critique, if you will, we can go linearity assumptions, right, that are problematic. But we know more now than we knew before. And the fact that we're not doing more is a volitional statement, is a character flaw that needs to be interrogated, addressed, and we need to take responsibility for it. So, kids are fine, it's the adults we have to fix. Thank you.
But we don't. For another question, let's facilitate a more informal discussion. We have a reception next door. Let's give our speaker another hand. My community and welcoming her, and then there's also some other activities later, but we'll be attentive about her time and continue to engage her. Thank you all for those who were able to.
Thank you. Yes.